welcome to our next STInG chat session. This is the third one we've presented. This one we're calling How to Build a Career as a Biostatistician. So I'm Andrew Forbes from Monash University, and co-hosting this session with Kristy Robledo from the Clinical Trials Centre at the University of Sydney, which is way there. And Kristy was on our panel for the last session, but she's now one of the interviewers. So we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians and the lands which we are gathered today. For me, is the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. For Kristy in Sydney, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also the lands on which all of you are gathered today, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. So just before we get started, I'd like to give you a little background about ACTA STInG and this STInG chat session. So the STInG in STInG chat is the Statistics in Trials interest group of ACTA, Australian Clinical Trials Alliance. And you're here, obviously, because you're members of ACTA STInG. So the main objective of STInG is to provide professional development opportunities and strengthen links amongst clinical trial statisticians across Australia, and also to give any hints or tips on building a career in clinical trial statistics, which is what this session is about. So this is our third STInG chat session. In June of this year, we ran a session about grant funding, and in August last year, we ran a session called Climbing the Biostatistics Career Cascade, or something of that form, very close. That session was like from a senior biostatistician perspective. So we're going to flip it completely this time, and we're going to hear from some two early to mid-career researchers about their paths building a biostatistics career from day one of their PhD completion and onwards. So I'll hand over now to Kristy, and she'll talk about the format of the session and introduce our two guests that we're going to interview today. So over to you, Kristy.
Thanks, Andrew. So thanks everybody for joining us for this lunchtime session today. So first of all, questions. So if you are not comfortable in raising your hand to ask a question at any time, please feel free to pop your hand up. Otherwise, there is a Q&A bottom down the, well, it's the bottom right for me on my screen, but it may be in a different spot for you. If you just want to pop that in there, if you're not comfortable putting your hand up, and we'll try and get to your question as it kind of slots into our predefined questions we've already got in front of us. So yes, today we have the privilege, thank you both for joining us. I'm going to give a very brief intro because the first question I'm going to ask is for them to tell us about themselves. So we have Associate Professor Lisa Yelland joining us. She's a Senior Research Fellow in the Women and Children's theme and the co-chair of the Biostatistics Unit at the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute. So thank you for joining us, Lisa. And then we've also got Dr. Hannah Johns joining us. So she's a research fellow in the Melbourne Medical School at Melbourne University. So thank you again for joining us today. And I'm gonna direct this question first to Hannah, and then we'll go to Lisa next. But I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your career to date. So what undergraduate, any postgraduate research, PhDs, etc., and then maybe how many years post-PhD as well. So thank you, Hannah.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so my undergraduate was in applied mathematics at RMIT, specifically in a specialty around cryptography, which is not what I imagined. I did not imagine going into statistics back then. And I took a bunch of electives in computer science stuff. So it was a very like computational maths-ish sort of background. And then during that, because one of the things that my degree is very good at was screaming jobs at us at every possible point that they got, I was lucky enough to do a student placement at Flora Neuroscience, which, depending on how you looked at it, I was either turned to the dark side or saw the light and gained more of an interest in statistics. that led into doing an honours, looking at some statistics around emergency department research. And then that led into a PhD, which has sort of naturally progressed into doing postdoc work. So more or less fell into the field I'm working in now. I'm about 5.5 years post-PhD, and have been working in and around primarily stroke research since.
Hey, so you went straight pretty much from your undergrad into a PhD.
Yes, that was a choice that I made. I'm not sure if it was necessarily the best one for taking a break, but no, I went full from the undergrad into honours into PhD.
Great. We'll come back to that later because I've got a question about specific moments, but we might throw to Lisa now. Thanks, Lisa, for telling us a little bit more about your career path.
Sure. So I've got a little bit of a different path to Hannah, I guess. I went through Adelaide University to Bachelor of Mathematical Sciences, majoring in pure maths and statistics. And right from the beginning, I was kind of hooked on stats and thought that's where I wanted to be in terms of a career. So I finished my undergrad. I did an honours year in statistics. And then again, different to Hannah, I went and worked for a couple of years first. I was always planning to go back and do a PhD, but I just wanted to get some practical workplace experience first. So I then went on and did my PhD in statistical methods for clinical trials. And I'm now I'm 13 years post-PhD, but if you take into account all my career disruptions and part-time work, I'm only 8 years, so still an MCR.
Yeah, thank you. And so for you, Hannah, what would you describe your current position, particularly in terms of the mix of like applied and methods work?
Yes, so my current position is I am a research fellow employed specifically by the Australian Stroke Alliance at University of Melbourne, where most of the stuff I do falls under that particular umbrella. And the whole goal there is around improving access to stroke care around Australia, specifically focusing on improving care within the golden hour is what it's called, post-stroke to treat, because time is brain. In terms of what I actually do on a day-to-day basis with that is providing statistical expertise within that larger group around things around process modeling and simulation work, support for stroke trials which are being run as part of that group, and that covers both design and analysis. And then also when we don't have tools or methods which are suitable for what we're doing, either because they don't exist yet or because they haven't been implemented, then I will often be one of the people that is making those tools available to help us run the trials and analysis that we need to do.
Thank you. And what about you, Lisa? What's your kind of mix of applied and methods?
So I'm a senior research fellow at the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute, and there I'm actually based in the women and kids theme because a lot of my work is collaborating with people that work in women's and kids health, working on a lot of perinatal trials. And I also lead a team of 8 statisticians there who are doing a mix of consulting and work and methods research. So I guess a lot of my time now is more on kind of managing the team, supervising the consulting project work. I don't have much in the way of actual funding for methods research at the moment. So yeah, it's more kind of, administrative responsibilities, team leadership, and collaborating with other researchers at the moment.
Thank you so much. I'll pass over to Andrew. Oh, Andrew, I can't hear you.
My apologies. Now I want you to think back when you were saying the last year of your PhD. What were you thinking you were going to do immediately post PhD? And did that eventuate? And what was your actual first position post PhD? And just if you could briefly describe the mix of applied work and methods work in the immediate post PhD position. We'll start with Lisa. Thanks.
So I worked for a few years prior to my PhD, and during my PhD, I continued in that role for 1 day a week. So I guess my plan was always to kind of continue on in my old job, but with a new qualification. So that was mostly working as a consultant in clinical trials. But because I had the PhD, I got promoted to the next level. And I also ended up I did that part-time and ended up taking on another role as a part-time, again, trial statistician. And there, that was even at a higher level where I was given some staff who were direct reports to me and given a bit more responsibility. So having the PhD allowed me to kind of do the work that I had already been doing in that first year out, but just with more responsibility.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. So straight away after PhD, you got increased responsibility resulting from that. And what was the mix of applied and particularly methods work then after the PhD, in that you were sort of continuing in the same role with greater responsibilities? Could methods fit into that?
Yeah, so I didn't have any funding at that point, that first year out. I didn't have any funding for methods research, but I had the momentum from my PhD and I knew that I wanted to continue with research. So I was able to get kind of a few first author papers out on methods research projects over the first year or two after the PhD. So that helped to keep the research going for me.
Was that largely in your own time rather than being sort of funded or sort of quarantine time?
Yeah, it was partly in my own time, and partly I did have one quite supportive manager who, you know, was encouraging of people, you know, building up their track records as well. So I had a bit of work time to do it.
Oh, okay, right. Thanks, Lisa. And Hannah, in the last year of your PhD,
Yes.
where you are now?
Yeah, so I was fairly lucky in that the PhD work that I was doing transitioned fairly seamlessly into a postdoc position, more or less extending on what I was doing previously. So I was a research fellow working in stroke rehab for a bit, mainly playing around with some trial data that they had collected, where about 2,100 patients, big trial. And the aim of what we're trying to do there was looking at predicting outcomes post-stroke. The problem with this is that physiotherapy studies physio is not a pill. It's a very highly complex, multifaceted intervention which happens over time. And as a result of that, lots of the stats methods that we have aren't particularly well suited to deal with that. And also the size of the data, while large, not large enough to really justify throwing into your big capital ML machine learning AI type approaches. So necessity being the mother of invention, what ended up happening was doing a bunch of methodological work to try and build tools that would let us actually go out doing that. So lots of work from that perspective, where I was quite lucky in that I was able to do some methods work that was really driven by the clinical aim of what we're trying to do. And on top of that, did a bunch of work supporting a currently ongoing trial in stroke rehab, where I was implementing fairly basic tools around semi-automated trial monitoring, which helped streamline a lot of other people's processes within the research team.
You have to build those tools for the trial monitoring?
Yes. So I got intimately familiar with working with some of the behind-the-scenes stuff with REDCap to make that work.
All right. Okay. All right. Thanks. And back to Kristy again.
Okay. So just want to dive into a little bit on how you got started in your methodological research that you're working in at the moment. So really about how you found your research area. So Hannah, you might have already answered this already. But did someone have like a funded methods grant that you were then appointed to work in, or did you come up within the area that you wanted to work in yourself, or was it a combination of the two? So we'll start with Hannah maybe and then go to Lisa.
So in my experience, the trick for lots of stuff that I've been working from a methods perspective is driven by clinical need, and where it has been a case of us coming up with things that we have come up with by ourselves, it's largely in the category of we think that this method that exists for addressing this specific clinical problem that we have over there is not necessarily as good as it could be, and we think we could do better. So it's all largely been driven from that clinical need, and either driven because we're making compromises in terms of the analyses that we're doing, or because we think we can do better than the existing approaches to things. So it's all being done largely in collaboration with clinical researchers that drive lots of the acceptability of things in terms of the methods, because ultimately at the end of the day, from a methods perspective, the stuff that I'm interested in from that perspective is stuff that's going to get used, and therefore it needs to be something which is driven by a real clinical need.
Yeah. And so you continued in the stroke theme from your PhD because that's where someone already had funded position for you to.
Absolutely. So yep. Also, stroke has been an interesting area to work in that there's lots of very fun stats problems to work with. So you've got we're stuck dealing with ordinal outcome data for lots of things, which leads to all sorts of interesting problems.
Happens in babies too, I'm surely. Lots of us could talk about that.
Yes,
but
yes. So there's lots of interesting stats problems that are driven by the nature of the research that's being done, and so that's really fun to work in.
It's funny how we use that word fun. Other people might not use it, but I would agree with you that it's fun.
Yep. So
Lisa, how about you? How it sounds like you were the same. It was like almost a continuation of your job / PhD is then where you found yourself at the end of your PhD?
Yeah, so I started working in perinatal trials very early on, and every piece of research I've done has really been driven by a practical problem coming out of a trial, whether it's specific to perinatal trials, or whether it's a more general trial issue. It's all come up out of that applied work. So the interesting thing in perinatal trials is that we often have infants who come from single or multiple births. So we get this mixture of independent and clustered data. So that throws up all kinds of issues that have kept me busy for a long time. Yeah, so so I didn't have, there was no specific grant around, methods for that area. I was supported by an early career fellowship from NHMRC, like the equivalent of the EL1 in the investigator grant scheme now. So that's how I was able to continue research in that area. But it's really just, what I've been working on throughout my career and what's most interesting and fun to me, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that reflects what I do as well, is there's a huge interplay between your applied and methods work, and it's very hard to actually disentangle them from each other at times.
Absolutely.
All right, I'll pass back over to Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, as Kristy just said, so both of you, your methods work really comes from your applied work. What sort of message would you give to people sort of nearing the end of the PhD on that front, in terms of finding methods areas to work on? Because you're finishing PhD, so you'd say, oh, I've got my research topic, and maybe there's a couple of little extra things. I'm going to have to find something else to work on. Can you just describe briefly sort of some advice for those nearing a PhD about finding a methods topic? I'm going to start with you, Lisa.
I think it's a good point to go and get a consulting job, an applied job, at least part-time. I mean, methods research money is pretty hard to come by. And, given that, often, the most interesting problems to solve are the ones that come out of the applied work. Yeah, getting some real work experience is a good place to start, I think.
Yeah, and Hannah?
No, fully agree with Lisa. It's the methods problems will come from doing the applied work. On top of that, doing the applied methods work will also build a network of clinical collaborators, which is vital for doing this sort of methods work if you're wanting those methods to be used in practice. The other thing which it will give you in terms of that networking perspective is a group of people that you can run ideas past to get an idea about how acceptable they are from the stats methods you're coming up with from a clinical perspective. Because if the clinicians don't understand what you're doing, don't understand why you're doing and why you care, then it can be a fantastic method, no one's going to use it. And so I think the building of the clinical network, which you do through doing applied work, is really vital to lots of different aspects of this.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I mean, this is a really clear message that's coming through, like to work as a biostatistician, by the very nature of the discipline is collaborative. And I suppose there are some people who just work on methods and write very technical papers, but by and large, the sort of the road to career progression is really to be engaging in the applied work and then finding the problems to solve from that applied work. And both of you are some wonderful examples of that. So we're going to change tack a bit now, and I'll hand back to Kristy.
So Hannah, I alluded to this before about if there was a pivotal moment or a decision that you made that you think put you in the position that you are now, and what that was and how you made that decision. So I'll go to Hannah first and then to Lisa.
Oh, so the obvious one from that I mentioned before was the early undergrad workplace stuff, which really put me on the entire career path that I'm now on. Other than that, in general, when I've had the opportunity to and said yes to working on larger research projects with people that I've not really engaged with before, in order to be exposed to more stuff which has been a little bit outside of what my usual stuff has been. So some examples of that was, I think, at early days of COVID, I think everyone was working on some variety of COVID research because it was the nature of what was happening at the time. I was working on a bunch of emergency modeling for the flying doctors, which was a somewhat tense couple of weeks as we were doing that, because it was a case of 10 a.m. meeting, build model during the day, run model overnight, go to sleep about 2 a.m., get up and repeat the process. But that's led to some of the ongoing work that I'm now doing as part of the Stroke Alliance. Likewise, various larger clinical trials that I've had the opportunity to jump on board and work in that have led to major publications that have also led to ongoing international clinical collaborations. It's been a couple of everything that's been a pivotal moment has been an opportunity to work with people that I've not worked with before.
And saying yes is a theme here.
Yes.
Saying yes to this talk. Okay, great. Thanks. And what about you, Lisa? Do you think there's a single pivotal moment for you or several combined, or what do you think?
I think the one that's really led me down the path that I've ended up on was getting my fellowship, having that dedicated research funding. So I think I was about a year post PhD, and I was enjoying my clinical trials applied work, but I was still wanting to do research. And someone said, "Oh, you should apply for a fellowship." And so I gave it a crack, and I was fortunate to get one. And then, I had time to really focus on my research to, build up my track record. And I think things just kind of snowballed from there. Like once you've got that bit of research money and you're doing research, and people start, seeing you in a different way. They see you more as a potential leader. Had really great people around me to support me on my career path. You start getting more invitations. Oh, do you want to collaborate with us? Do you want to go on this grant? Do you want to be on this paper? Join this committee? Review this paper? And again, saying yes to things helps. it just kind of it took off from there. So that was definitely the defining moment for me.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to pass back over to Andrew.
Yeah, just following on that from Lisa, yes, you sort of talked about people were quite encouraging for you to do methods work and continue on in that strain. So did you have any sort of formal mentoring or informal, or is there a person you thought of as a mentor who really guided you in the early stages post PhD? Either in your institution or outside of your institution? Apart from the wonderful guidance of ACTA STInG, of course.
I've had lots of great people along the way. Look, I was really lucky with the bosses that I've had have all been really encouraging and supportive. So my first boss, who was always also my PhD supervisor, he was a statistician and he really helped me get going on that stats pathway and just laid the foundation for everything I've done since then. And then my next boss and sort of my mentor during my fellowship was actually not a statistician, more like a perinatal trialist. And, she was amazing in terms of, just encouraging like women in research and leadership opportunities and introducing me to people, making the right connections, just giving me the opportunities and sort of things to aspire to. So, I've really learned a lot from those people. I've not had an external mentor along the way, and I don't have a mentor at the moment. I guess what I've got is a bunch of really great people around me in more senior roles who, give me something to aspire to. And then now I'm the mentor, so I'm supporting my staff and students and other people along the way. So it's nice to take on that other role now.
What's your advice in terms of mentoring for a young, recent PhD graduate? How does one find one?
I mean, there are official programs like the Statistical Society runs a mentoring program. ACTA STInG has the mentoring for the data safety monitoring boards if you're wanting to get mentoring specifically in that. Sometimes organisations have a mentoring program, so there might be some sort of official path you can go through to get a mentor. Otherwise, just networking and asking someone. Like I think people appreciate the opportunity to share their expertise and guide people. So yeah, just putting yourself out there and asking if there's no other way to get one.
Are there any systems at the University of Adelaide or Adelaide University or SAHMRI?
Yeah, I think SAHMRI's got its own mentoring program, and within specific research, like there's a few CREs that I've been involved with that have different sort of internal mentoring schemes as well. So yeah, there's actually lots of different ways to access, and yeah, all through professional societies.
Okay, and Hannah, from your perspective too?
Yeah, more or less in full agreement with what Lisa has just described. One thing I would add to this in terms of mentors is that it's important to have both statistical and clinical if you're working in biostats. For all the reasons I was talking about before in terms of feedback around methods and so on and so forth, but also while we're not focusing on like funding in this particular talk, things like grant writing, if you're planning on going down a more like clinical side of things, you learn the language of how clinicians speak from interacting with and being mentored by clinicians, and therefore having access to outside of statistical expertise is also really, really vital. But yeah, no, stats mentors are also really, really important, especially from the perspective of as you're learning, it takes forever to learn how to be a biostatistician because it's such a broad area. Having someone you can ask thorny questions when you're lost in terms of specifics of analysis is really, really vital. and they can often point you in the direction of related methods and discussions in different corners of literature that you'd never even thought of before. So it's really vital from that perspective as well.
And was your sort of clinical mentor guiding you in understanding the clinical aspects of the research you were working with? Like, for example, when I started off working with in areas anesthesia, someone gave me a document that I wrote called Anesthesia 101, and that was tremendously useful, just as, and you know, a connection with someone who could really guide you to the really important aspects to learn in the clinical area.
Absolutely.
Okay, over to Kristy.
I'm a little
I should
jealous of these
mention,
people. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I should mention, please, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we can ask them either at the end, or if it's relevant, we can ask them in the course of particular discussion going on. And sort of in the past, when we've been talking about specific points and questions that come in, they've sort of stimulated some good sort of areas for addressing further. So please don't be shy about putting in questions. So sorry, over to you, Kristy.
I was just going to say, a bit jealous about how people have these like areas like stroke and perinatal research, because mine is such a variety on what I do. And there was one time where you're working at Nepean Hospital and you would get a cardiologist in your first hour, and then your next hour would be an anaesthetist, and then you'd have somebody else, and you'd have to start off with, okay, draw me a picture. What are you talking about? But we do just have a chat, just a question in about the biggest difference. What would make the biggest difference to your day-to-day work aside from getting tenure? So yeah, what's a tool, maybe writing code, Hannah, or some sort of grant writing tool that would make a big difference to your day-to-day work?
Oh man, that's a very broad question. Would you mind if we thought about this and I'll come back to it later? Because otherwise I'll need to have a think about that one.
You don't have to say one. You could say more than one thing if you want. What about you, Lisa? Would it be someone to help organise the people that you've got to look after, or what kind of biggest difference would there be for you?
Yeah, look, having a personal assistant, I think once you've got, you know, I'm overseeing so many people, but so many individual projects in, you know, I mean, all the projects aren't in perinatal trials. There are cardiology and other things going on as well. So just having someone to keep track of all the things I'm doing, my team's doing, would be fantastic. That's on my wish list.
Balls up in the air. Yeah.
I think that the biggest thing for me would be better integration of all of the bits of information that need to be managed with different projects. And that's covering both analysis code and data and so on and so forth. Often in practice, because of the way that research works, everything is sort of pulled together and you make do.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, you have to build your own system for managing different bits of information as they come through. More streamlined processes around that sort of stuff would save a lot of time, I think, in terms of the day-to-day, because large chunks of time is spent familiarizing yourself with things that you may have worked on 6 months ago and need to revisit because the paper's just gone through revision, or just because people have not sent you clean data and you then have to spend a bunch of time going through and cleaning it and stuff like that.
Yeah. Right, could spend quite a while trying to figure out how to raise an IT ticket with UCID. That could be better. Something else.
That sort of stuff.
Great. So just coming back to another point that we were talking about before, Lisa, you talked briefly about networking. So how important do you think it is to have this network of maybe statisticians, and whether you have a separate network maybe of clinicians, but yeah, how important do you think those networks are, and how did you build yours? I'll start with Lisa.
Yeah, look, networking is just so important, especially when you're early in your career and you're trying to establish yourself. So for me, I didn't know anything about what was out there. I was in my undergrad and I got invited to come along to a local Stat Society seminar that one of my lecturers was giving a talk at. And so I rocked up, and here were all these people that I'd never met before. And, you know, they were quite welcoming of new people and new students coming through. And so I got chatting to a few people. I started coming along to the monthly meetings. And then I got actively involved in Stat Society. So I got onto the local SA branch council and started organising some events for young statisticians. I went on to become, you know, I was newsletter correspondent for a while. I ended up being president of the state for a little while. So, you know, you get connected, and then you start not only knowing people from your local branch, but, you know, nationally as well when you turn up to the conferences. And so I found the Stat Society to be a really helpful way to build up my early networks. And once people know you and they know you go on a committee, they invite you to do something else and your name gets put up for things. So yeah, the network just grows from there. And then when I had my fellowship funding, I had some money to go traveling. So, you know, I could go, I attended some conferences overseas, and I went and visited key, you know, international people that I wanted to work with. I just, you know, sent them an email and said, hey, I was really interested in your research, read your paper, wanted to do something related. Did you want to work on this with me? So, you know, just making those connections, you know, you can just contact people. You can just ask that way, going along to conferences and just talking to lots of different people. Yeah, I think it's all really important.
Great, thanks. And what about you, Hannah?
Yeah, no, fully agree. It's absolutely vital, not only from a career perspective and getting involved in all sorts of different things. It's also really important just from a purely practice perspective. Biostats is a vast field and no one can know everything. And the point there is that having a network of statisticians lets you know who you can ask for advice. In my experience, most of us are massive nerds that really enjoy talking about statistics, and are therefore more than happy to spend a little bit of time talking through whatever their particular favorite subject is. So knowing what you don't know is good, but knowing who to ask if you need to know it is even better. And the only way to get that is by building a network of other statisticians. In terms of, I think I've alluded to it before, but I think in my experience, the way to build that has been saying yes to opportunities that either expose you to unfamiliar topics, let you interact with people outside of your immediate sphere, or coming back to the point of the knowing who to ask, let you demonstrate and talk about your own particular niche interest that you're interested in biostats, because that's then how people know to come to you if they need information about whatever your particular area is working on. And all three of those are really important. And you do it by saying yes to things. Going to conferences, seminars, and workshops are also really vital for that as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, I'm going to pass back over to Andrew, and I think the question in the chat plays nicely into your question, Andrew.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat here. Have you had to choose between what you're interested in versus what other people who pay your salary think would be useful for them? So between what you really want to do and what others want you to do, and if you sort of had to encounter that situation, what would you do? Go Lisa first. Oh no, Hannah's smiling more. I'll go to Hannah.
Okay, cool. I would say that if you are at the situation where you've got this particular tension, it should be dealt with before it gets to this point, really. You need to have, in my experience, from a methodological perspective, you need to have clinician buy-in very early on. You need to, like, it comes back to the point of if you're wanting people to use particular methods that you're building or particular ways of going about things, you need the people that are running the trials and have running the trials that are actually going to be using the methods interested in what you're doing. And so from that perspective, you need to have a you need to involve them very early on with this. That can involve lots of very frustrating conversations as you're going back and forth in circles, trying to articulate what the problem is you're trying to address in a specific way. But ultimately, it's really valuable and worth it as you get there in the end. So from that perspective, buy-in from clinical people very early on, and it's always important to come back to the question: why do you want to be looking at whatever methods of research you're doing, over just throwing it into, say, a logistic regression model and calling it a day? So from that perspective, feedback from clinical colleagues is really vital here in terms of if what you're suggesting is worth pursuing before you invest however many months of time you need to spend on doing the methods research. And also, and if you're doing this for stuff that you're talking about for using your own methods that you've developed, you should have this already because you should involve them very early on in the process. So coming back to the early example I gave earlier, talking about the work in stroke rehab, I spent many hours in my boss's office going through different approaches to dealing with some of the data analysis and butting heads a whole bunch to try and get to something which was actually acceptable for everyone that was involved. It took a lot of work to get there, but it was absolutely worth it in the end. And the final methods that we built were ultimately worth it as a result. What this does mean is that in practice, when you're doing methods research, in my experience, it's lots of rapid prototyping. If you have an idea of you think this is going to work, you don't sweat it out. You don't sweat it in terms of the specifics of the details until you know that the general concept is fine. So as an example of this, it would be nice to have a derived method of calculating standard errors for some measure you've come up with, but don't spend time on doing that until you know that the thing that you're estimating is something people are going to be interested in. And so throw either bootstrapping or permutation tests or something like that at it, which will provide that same information until you know that it's going to be something which is fine. So looking for those shortcuts very early on to get a rough prototype of something ready to show to people is very important. And that's how you avoid the situation to start with.
That takes a level of assertiveness. Any tips for assertiveness training or being assertive for young researchers when there is pretty significant power imbalance with the clinical, the hotshot clinical researcher?
Oh, great question. Okay, so I think with the assertiveness stuff, it comes back to knowing when it's important to give ground versus when it's important to really stand your ground. Things that are the important things here are, number one, of course, statistical validity. The other thing is in terms of the amount of time that it's going to take to do a particular thing, a particular way, and so on and so forth. In my experience, the best way to deal with this has been to know your guideline documents. Know what, for example, the FDA guidance for industry is, and if there is any domain-specific literature on particular methods and things that people are happy with, not happy with. If you can use these to reference some sort of authoritative guideline about why to do or not to do something, often really helps, and that can be used to justify, coming back to the point of methods research, why you're saying, okay, we need to do this, but we need to do this, we need to do this, but none of these tools will handle all of these three things we care about simultaneously. So we're trying to build something which does that. And people generally get that if you're going from, if you approach it from that perspective. More generally in terms of being assertive around explaining why you're going to do something or not going to do something, I find telling someone that you'll be absolutely destroyed by a statistical reviewer is often a very powerful way of getting people's attention. And it's also entirely accurate because if you don't do the appropriate thing from a stats perspective, you do get destroyed in review.
Has the mentor, just tying in with the mentoring, has a mentor role been useful in your experience when to really push something with the investigators?
I would say so, absolutely. The knowing when and how to pick the battles is something that I've absolutely picked up from mentors. It's how it comes part and parcel, I think, with the learning how to speak the language of clinical researchers and the clinical colleagues that you're working with, because you can talk about how doing your analysis this particular way versus this particular way is going to minimize bias or improve efficiency of your standard errors and stuff like that. All you like, but unless the clinical people you're working with understand that, then they're not going to really care. And so from that perspective, I think a large part of this as well comes into effectively education. And there's an element of needing to educate your clinical colleagues about what you're doing in terms of the statistical considerations. And that's a bigger, more ongoing topic that you just pick up things over time. And like lots of us, you learn to do it by doing it, and you pick up the tips and tricks from your mentors. So absolutely, mentorship is really important.
Thanks. That's great. Great response there. So Lisa, same sort of question to you about, things other people want you to do. They're paying your salary versus what you think needs to be done. Have you encountered that, and how did you address that?
Yeah, so my salary has often been paid across multiple projects. And so, there's a bit of money in this trial for statistical support, and then another trial, and then another project. And we know trial budgets are often tight. And, I guess the reality is, well, yeah, it would be nice to do this methods research, but if there's already a way to answer this question without the methods research, then, there's no budget for that methods research. So I think you've got to be realistic about what you can achieve, and then the goal then is to get the funding for the methods research, or to get a student who can work on that. So you're not giving up on the idea, but you're also not expecting a trial investigator to pay for your methods time when it wasn't part of their budget.
Yeah, well, that's where the question was sort of leading to, that if you're working closely with a sort of a clinical area research group that's funding part of your time, should you be pushing to say, well, we can really make some strong developments that are going to be applicable in your area, but you need to have some methods funding time? And have you ever been in a situation where you've been able to say, look, if I could spend a day a week working on this method that I've seen, that I'm sure it's applicable, and then you outline why it would be applicable, and then say you spend a day a week for a month, maybe 4 to 8 days, a month or two, a day a week, working on the method at the expense of the people paying your salary. So you sort of have to sort of be quite assertive in saying, well, the method that needs to be used needs some very development time to tailor it for the specific application.
I haven't had to have that conversation. I've tried to get the methods funding from elsewhere. I don't know about Hannah.
From my perspective, project work normally comes in waves. Mainly because I think this is a feature because I primarily work within one specific domain area. So what ends up happening is when grants come due and when conference deadlines start to come up, is when you start to see the big rise in work. And so when there's lots of clinical work that needs to be applied work that needs to be done, that ends up taking pretty much all of the attention and all of the time. And then when you do get a little bit of breathing room, that's when you start thinking more about the methods work. Something which I find very useful with it is to think about the potential impact before committing to things. This comes back to the stuff we're talking about in terms of the build prototypes first and get clinical buy-in. But on top of that, think about the time constraints in terms of the type of research you're going to be doing. So for things that are simulation projects evaluating a particular method, often what you can do is you can get the bulk of some of that stuff done by setting, if you have a old laptop or something like that, I will often just have an old laptop running in the background after I've written some code to quickly check something, and then that can run in the background while I'm doing other work. Often methods work unless it's grounded in doing lots of statistical from foundations, derivation of particular estimators and so on and so forth. Often you can get away with just coding some stuff up in the background that will then just churn through whatever you're looking for and looking at, and then let that run in the background. That said, in my experience, lots of this stuff is not really things which you get the time to do. Instead, often some of the ideas of things are fundamentally shower thoughts that you then talk about with clinical colleagues and other statisticians. And as you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, then after it's matured enough to pursue, then you pursue it.
So do you feel there's sort of an element that you'll take risks in some situations? Like there's sort of the option of staying safe with tried and true methods versus taking risks with something that may or may not work. And so you may be spending quite a bit of time and then it not actually working out in the end. Either Hannah or Lisa, whoever wants to.
I think it depends on the project that you're working on and what the point of it is. Actually, a really good example of this is coming back to the predicting outcomes in stroke rehab situations. One of the early things I tried with that was effectively it was a wildly inefficient way of going about doing things because it was the best thought I could come up with. About 2 months of running on a supercomputer later, as we were trying to get stuff to work, I did get some actual valid clinical answers coming out of it. The answers that I got was if you're being hoisted out of bed using machine post having a stroke, you were probably going to have a bad outcome, which was not particularly useful. I do think that it's tricky with this sort of stuff. You can't really know if it's going to pay off until it will. Often, if you can prototype things to know if it will work or not ahead of time, then it's great. In terms of, I think it's important to distinguish between upfront time versus time that can be spent where it just sits and does stuff that you don't need to actively manage it. Because both of these are aspects of doing methods research, either because it's computation time or simulations evaluating something. And from that perspective, you need to, if you can do something which doesn't require much upfront time, but requires a bunch of time to run in the background while you're doing other things, then that's not particularly high risk. And often you can make some shortcuts in the early stuff, even if it increases the computation time it takes to run, then that's perfectly fine. Because you can bypass certain issues in terms of what you're doing by being willing to accept things running for a bit longer.
And Lisa, what about taking risks, going outside your comfort zone, something that is not 100% guaranteed versus just taking the safe route?
Yeah, look, I've done a little bit of this. I mean, for me, simulation studies are pretty safe. You'll be able to program them up, leave them running in the background, and you should get something out of it. The more risky stuff is, for me, the mathematical derivations where you're not really sure if it's going to come out nicely at the end, and you might have been really spending a lot of time and realizing it's not going anywhere. So I think I've done a little bit of that when I've had the research money and I've had the time, and you sort of hit a brick wall and you put it aside and you come back to it. And I've had a student doing some of that work as well, and we had a plan B in place. So if this doesn't pan out, we know where we're going to cut it off after a certain time, and we're going to pivot to this other thing. And it did work out, so that was all good. But I think either you've got lots of time and money available to keep going, or you have a point in time where you're just going to call it and say, look, this isn't going anywhere. I'll park it for now. I'll switch to something else.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar story that happened certainly in my career quite a lot of times, hoping nothing pans out to park it, but then the challenge is coming back to it at some stage. It's easy to just go into permanent parking. Almost out of time, but Kristy, maybe you can ask about sort of soft skills.
Yeah, we might go to the question that I wanted to ask, if that's okay, about soft skill.
Yeah.
Oh, it's kind of not really that soft, actually. So thinking back to now, maybe more a junior statistician who's just coming into biostats, what software would you recommend that they invest a significant amount of time in upskilling themselves in? So, you know, would it be SAS still, or Stata, or R, or, you know, what software, if any, and why would that be so? Just quickly to end on. I might go to Lisa first.
Sure. So I started out in SAS, and now I've switched over to Stata. I'm an occasional R user. So, you know, and obviously there's lots of R users out there. So I don't think there's one particular package that's going to be most relevant as a statistician. I think have a look at, you know, where you're currently employed, what's valued. Have a look at where you'd ideally want to be employed. What's your dream job and what's going to be valued there, in thinking about, you know, which one you actually want to focus on. But, you know, from my perspective, it probably doesn't matter. Learn one, learn it well. And then if you have to transition to another one, you already have a good understanding of how, you know, what's possible in software. You might have to figure out how to actually make it happen in the new package, but you've got the groundwork there. It's not so hard to transition once you've learnt one package really well. So yeah, take your pick, whatever's going to be most useful for where you think you want to end up working.
Yeah, that's a good spin to it. What about you, Hannah?
I think unfortunately you need to know a little bit, at least a little bit of multiple of these. So I am a big proponent of working in R. I love R. I love its flexibility. It means that if I'm having to wrangle complex data, it's very easy for me to do. Also, if you're doing methods research, it's very easy to release tools for whatever methods you have developed through CRANs, which is absolutely fantastic from that perspective. Stata, wonderfully managed walled garden, but deeply unpleasant to work with if you're doing more complicated analyses where you're having to combine multiple data sheets on the fly, or things are not as clean as you would like them to be, and so on and so forth. That said, it is worth specializing in one as your main driver, and then you move to the other platforms as you need to for specific things. So I think fully with Lisa here in terms of what is used in your area, what is used where you would like to be, and then go from that perspective, pick based on that.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you both very much. We appreciate all of your time to help us and answering all of our questions. So I guess we've got time for the last question if anybody's got anything. Otherwise, I'll let Andrew.
Yeah, okay. We're 1 minute to go. So I think we'll wrap up now. But thanks so much to Lisa and Hannah for these fantastic responses about getting moving in a career from, you know, sort of day one post PhD onwards, and tips and tricks for working with people, working with clinical researchers, and methods work. And everybody, thanks very much for coming along to the webinar, and thanks to Vivian and ACTA for organising all this. Wonderful job as usual. When you exit the WebEx, there'll be a short survey that would be really interested in your opinions, not only just on this session, but what other topics you might like to hear about, whether either in this sort of panel chat format or in a webinar format. But in ACTA STInG, we're always very interested to hear what the ACTA STInG membership is interested in hearing. So once again, thanks everyone for coming along, and our next meeting will be at the ACTA Annual Scientific Meeting in Melbourne on December
Third.
Third, we have an ACTA STING breakfast meeting. So for those of you who are at the conference in Melbourne, then please do come along to our STING breakfast meeting. So I think we'll wrap up, and thanks again, everyone.